First, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me here. It's a real honor for me to come and present to you, and I have appreciated meeting all of you who are working in the field. I look forward to meeting more of you. So, as goes on the slide, the topic is the search for universals. Roman Jakobson was a famous linguist phonologist who worked in the 1930s and the 1940s up to the 1950s. And he had a very interesting proposal that no one else had put forward, at least not as carefully as he did. And what he noticed was, through his research, he found links between the phonological systems of the languages of the world, the loss of language with aphasia, and the way children acquire phonology of their mother tongue. And this was very novel in 1941 when his book was published. So this talk, we're not going to talk about aphasia, but I will be talking about the phonological systems of the languages of the world and phonological acquisition in children. So this is just the front of the book. This is the 1968 version that's in English. And I actually was in graduate school before this was published and had to read it in German, because that's what it was originally written in. It's much easier for me to read it in English, I must say. Okay, so what was Jakobson's view about phonological acquisition and languages of the world? He noticed that, or he proposed that in both acquisition and adult languages, there were certain, what he called laws of irreversible solidarity, big long term. But basically what he was saying was that there are laws or rules that if something occurs in the language, something else also occurs. So 2 examples. He said that the presence of fricatives in a language implies the presence of stops. And he also noted that children, in their acquisition, substitute stops for fricatives. It's important to note that these laws of irreversible solidarity only go one direction. So the presence of fricatives implies the presence of stops, but the presence of stops does not imply the presence of fricatives. Another one of the laws was that the presence of back consonants, velars, uvulars, etc., implies the presence of front consonants. And we know that children, in acquiring their phonology, will often substitute front consonants, particularly alveolar consonants, for velar consonants. So if we want to put it very simply in terms of what Jakobson said, I would say, this is my interpretation of his proposals, the more common, that is, the more frequent phonemes from the languages of the world will be acquired before the less common phonemes. So here we're looking at languages of the world and acquisition. We can also say that if a child has a more, quote, complex phoneme, he will also have the less complex counterpart. So if a child has aspirated stops, he will also have unaspirated stops. One thing that we need to remember about Jakobson was that the database was very small, with heavy reliance on European languages and Slavic languages. We need to remember this book was published in 1941, meaning that most of his research was done in the 1930s. And there were really very few published studies of phonology at that point, and even fewer studies of child phonology. He basically used diary studies when he makes pronouncements about the acquisition of phonology by children. So I would say, looking through his book, he cited maybe 15 to 20 different adult languages, and maybe 8 to 10 languages acquired by children. So this is really a small database, yet he made some very important and actually quite accurate statements about these relationships. But what we need really to be able to test his hypotheses is a more representative database. So in 1984, Ian Madison published a book, the UCLA Phonological Segment Inventory Database. at UCLA. And this is what he said about the database. It was designed to give more reliable and more readily available answers to questions concerning the distribution of phonological segments in the world's languages. So this is not about acquisition. His database is simply about adult languages. He chose the languages for this database to, quote, approximate a properly constructed quota sample on a genetic basis of the world's extant languages. So what did he do? I have some more data to descriptions in a few slides. But the database includes the phonemic inventories of 317 languages. And he describes each phoneme in the segment in the database is represented by its most characteristic allophone. So, these are the language families, and I will not read them. These are the language families that are included in the database. So I give you the language family and the number of languages from that family that are included. This makes a very representative database. And the next slide I definitely will not read. First I'll read this one. The appendix includes a segment index listing all languages that have each phoneme. So the next slide provides an example of languages with the voiceless bilabial plosive P, which, according to him, occurs in 263 languages of the 317. So is one of the more common phonemes in the database. So these are all the languages, just 2 slides. These are all the languages that, according to his database, that's where we have a P, and I highlighted Korean, you will see. And when we get to the part on Korean, some people may say he did not categorize that phoneme correctly. But so here's some languages, and here are the rest of the languages that have P as a segment in their system. So this would mean that we would think that voiceless, unaspirated P would be acquired early if we think of Jakobson. And in fact, that's exactly what happens. P is frequent in languages of the world. It's also early acquired in young children, regardless of the language they're learning. Okay, so what are some general findings from this database? Well, I found this quite fascinating just looking at the variety of phonological systems that we have in languages of the world. So how many segments, how many phonemes are there in languages? Well, the range was from 11 to 141. Huge difference there. But the mean number of segments was 31, and the median was 28 or 29. 70% of the languages in the database have between 20 and 37 segments. More consonants than vowels, with the mean number of consonants being 22.8, mean number of vowels being 8.7. So you can think of Korean or whatever languages you know in relation to these to see how well they fit with these general findings. In terms of manner classes, stops occur in all languages, and I'll be exploring stops more. It's the only sound class, manner class, that occurs in all languages. 97% of the languages have at least one nasal, so nasals are also very common. 63% of languages have between 5 and 11 stops and affricates. He tends to group those together. 58% of languages have 1 to 4 fricatives. 91% of languages have 2 to 4 nasals. 41% have 2 liquids, and 72 languages have 2 approximants. Okay. Now these statements that also come from the UPSID text sound very much, to my mind, like things that Jakobson would say. So he notes that K does not occur without T. And when I have T with a little asterisk, that means dental or alveolar. He grouped those together. P does not occur without K. Nasal consonants don't occur unless there's a stop or affricate at the same place of articulation. M does not occur without N. And voiceless nasals, voiceless approximates, do not occur unless the language has the voiced counterparts. And again, if we look at these, I could make almost the same statements for acquisition. Okay. Now, moving to phonology and universals of phonological development, Jakobson's proposal was the following: all children, regardless of the language community in which they are raised, follow the same developmental path in acquiring the phonemes. He really looked at phonemic contrast, but phonemes of their language. It's pretty strong, all children. Surely there are going to be some exceptions, and indeed there are some exceptions. What kinds of support do we have for Jakobson's statements? Well, again, in general, his statements are true. They have been documented across many languages. So if we look at syllable shapes, what is the order of acquisition of syllable shapes? I'm not looking at segments now, I'm looking at syllables. The CV syllable is the most basic form. It's typically acquired before a CVC syllable or a CCV syllable, with C being consonant. Manner classes. We have stops acquired before fricatives and glides before liquids. And in terms of place, we tend to have front consonants before back consonants. Okay, why might these universal tendencies be true? Well, most people have argued, and many have argued, and many believe, that they're due to basic physiological constraints, that some phonemes are simply easier to produce and maybe to perceive than others. The problem with this, in terms of really trying to test this as a hypothesis, how do we measure ease of production? There's a lot of debate about that, and we won't answer it here, but I simply need to state that there is debate. Okay. I would say that in general, we find that acquisition of syllable types and place manner classes have been confirmed, but these are probabilistic. They're not absolute. In other words, we are going to have exceptions, and we have exceptions of two types. One is we find, even within the same language, we find individual differences. And secondly, we find language-specific differences. So one language will have a certain pattern, another language will have another, and at least one of those languages may not conform to the predictions that Jakobson would make. Okay, so why do we have differences? Well, again, we get back to kind of the same possible reasons that I mentioned earlier. So we have differences in articulatory complexity. However, we're going to measure that. We have differences in frequency of occurrence. So this is, how often does phoneme X, how often does B occur in the language? How often does S occur in the language? How often does K occur in the language? And then finally, we could see language-specific differences because of different phonological systems that we're looking at. So not numbers, not segments per se, but just the structure of the phonological system. How many phonemes does it have? What are the distributions of the place and manner of those phonemes? What are the syllable types? And I'm not even talking, and I won't talk anything about prosody, about stress patterns or tonal patterns, because Jakobson didn't talk about those, and that's somewhat beyond this talk, but surely those are going to also affect acquisition patterns. Okay, so articulatory complexity. Languages differ in the phonetic features of segments in the phonological system. So, examples. Hey, Korean. Laryngalized voiceless stops of Korean, or the laminal trilled R of Czech. Both of those are quite rare in languages of the world, and presumed, by Jakobson at least, to be complex. Why? Because they're rare. So we almost get a circular notion going on here. Children can't do it because it's complex. Why is it complex? Well, because it's not in languages of the world, etc., etc. So somehow we need to be able to disentangle this circle. So again, how do we measure complexity? The other one is, the next one that people often will bring up is frequency. The hypothesis is that the greater the frequency of a segment, I put element, but segment essentially, the earlier it will be acquired. Why? The child will hear it more, the child will attempt it more. But again, measuring frequency is not really straightforward. We say, oh, it's frequency, but what do we mean? Which aspects of frequency are we talking about? The frequency of a phoneme sequence, a syllable structure, a stress pattern. And for children in particular, are we measuring frequency via input or via what they say? Do we want to use an adult data set? and then say this is how adults talk, and so that's how the frequency is going to affect child speech? Or are we going to say this is how kids say, and that what kinds of frequency do we have from their data? Okay, and then we have the structure of the phonological system. So again, I put the example of Korean because I'm going to be talking about Korean. I'm hoping you'll be able to help me with some of my questions about Korean. But so Korean has an unusual number of stops. No, maybe not unusual number, but an unusual configuration of stops in the language. It has 9 stops, and they're all voiceless. And we'll talk more about those later. But that's not your typical stop, a system of stops across the world's languages. Okay, so people have tried to systematically look at effects of articulatory complexity, ambient frequency, and this measure called functional load, which I won't talk about a whole lot because we could spend a lot of time on that one. But anyway, there have been researchers, Stephanie Stokes, and I don't know who the first name of Surundam is, they looked at 3 databases, Cantonese, Dutch, and American English. And for each they were trying to say, what is the order of acquisition for these languages, and how does that interface with these other variables? So how did they measure articulatory complexity? Well, they used data from English. I hate to say, so much of our stuff is on data from English as though English were the only language of the world, but that's where we are right now. So they said there were 4 sets of phonemes based on articulatory complexity, and I show them to you there, and they look reasonable. Ambient frequency, the measure that they used for ambient frequency was the frequency of occurrence of initial consonants in adult speech, not adult speech to children, adult speech, period. And functional load has to do with phonemic contrast. How often is a phoneme involved in a phonemic contrast within the language? Presumably those that are not very involved may be acquired late because there is that contrast is not very important. So I think, okay. An example is the use of ev in English, the voiced interdental of English, or voiced interdental fricative. Not very many contrasts that involve that particular phoneme. And that may be one reason it's acquired late. Okay, what were her findings? What were their findings? So they looked at two aspects of acquisition. First was age of emergence, and it's important. Tomorrow I'm going to give a tutorial on language on phonological development, and we need to always think about these terms and how people are going to define them. But the first finding had to look at age of emergence. Okay, and that's when they look simply at what the child says. They're not looking at accuracy. They're not saying that this is correct or incorrect. They're simply saying when a child produces words, these are the sounds that the child produces. And so for age of emergence, for Cantonese, frequency accounted for 63% of the variance in age of emergence. For English, functional load, how often a phoneme is involved in phonemic contrast, accounted for 55% of the variance. And for Dutch, there weren't any data, and I'm not sure why. I would have to go back to the original. So phonetic inventory, as I give a definition at the bottom there. So the second measure is one that probably more people use, and this looks at accuracy. So accuracy of production, and this is when the kids were 24 to 25 months. For English, accuracy, the greatest effect on accuracy was articulatory complexity. For Dutch, it was frequency, and for Cantonese, there were no data. So it's not as though we can say, oh, articulatory complexity is the most important aspect, or frequency is the most important aspect. All right. Okay. I see that I'm working on not my most recent. I tweaked this morning, but the tweaks aren't here, so excuse me if I look puzzled. So what I want to show is turn to stops. So we're going to look at phonological acquisition of stops, but we're also going to consider stops in the languages of the world. And we'll go specifically at the end of the talk towards the acquisition of stops in Korean. So all languages have stops. I said that before. 51% of the language have two, quote, manner types. And this is using the terminology that was in the UPSID database. By manner type, we know that stop is a manner. Well, what they mean by manner type is a stop voiced, voiceless, ejective, aspirated, laryngalized. That's what they're calling a manner type. Half of the languages have two types at least, and 24% of languages have three types, okay? 92% of languages have plain voiceless stops, 67 have plain voice, 28% of languages have voiceless unaspirated, and now we have our Korean set. Less than 1% of languages have laryngalized voiceless stops. You would think that they'd be acquired late. Okay, place of articulation, I think there are no surprises here. 54% of languages have 3 places, 33 have 4 places, 11% of languages have 5 places. And if we look at the most common places of articulation, bilabial, dental alveolar, and velar. Okay. Now, if we look at acquisition, what kinds of data do we have? So that were languages of the world. Now we're going to turn to acquisition. Stops are frequent in babble. By babble, I mean prelinguistic, non-meaningful vocalizations, usually produced between 6 and 10 months, 6 and 12 months, sometimes longer than that. In a language with VOT differences in stops, and Jim Flagey talked about VOT differences this morning, voiceless, unaspirated stops are acquired before voiceless aspirated or before voice stops, depending upon the language system, what stop series you have. And in general, front stops, bilabial and dental alveolar, are acquired before back stops. Okay, so an uncommon system of stops. So now we're going to look at Korean. And if I make mistakes, you can tell me during the questions. All right. So stops have 3 manner types: aspirated, fortis, laryngalized. I don't know what's the most common term. I don't know what's the best term, and I'm not sure that those are identical. But the terms, I've seen them both. In the article that I wrote with the doctoral student, we used the term fortis. The UPSID database uses the term laryngalized. And then we have Lennis stops. And the Lennis stops in the UPSID database are classified as voiceless unaspirated. Okay. The characteristics: aspirated phonemes are produced with strong aspiration, aspirated stops. Fortis stops are produced unaspirated and laryngalized. Latiphobic uses the term stiff voice. I've also seen the term creaky voice, and I don't know if there's consensus on the descriptors or whether these things actually, or people are disagreeing and wanting to use one term versus another. And the Lennis stops are described as being slightly aspirated and breathy. So some of those are common, perhaps some of them are uncommon. Places of articulation for Korean stops are the most common: bilabial, dental alveolar, and velar. Okay. So the study that I did with a doctoral student, it was part of her dissertation, Min-Soon Kim, was actually she actually looked at acquisition of obstruents, word initial position by young Korean children. She had data from 40 children in 4 age groups. The age groups were 2.5, that's 2 years, 6 months, 3 years, 3.5, and 4. So 10 children in each group. The data, she collected the data in a naming situation where the children were asked to name a specific set of toys, objects, and picture cards. She then transcribed the productions, And in total, there were about 1,700 tokens that we gathered and she transcribed that were part of the analysis. So the goals of the study were first to document what's happening with acquisition of stops in Korean. Second, to try and look at some of these questions that I raised earlier about phonetic complexity and acquisition. What is the effect of phonetic complexity on acquisition? And lastly, the effects of frequency on acquisition. Okay, so what did we find? Again, she has two measures of accuracy. So we're not looking at just phonetic inventory. She's actually looking at accuracy. And to be included in a child who has these particular phonemes as emerging in their phonological system means that they had to have at least one correct token of the target phoneme. And so what you can see here is that some phonemes at age 2.5, all of the children had an accurate production of that phoneme by 2.5, and so it went on. Particularly, the laryngalized stops are the ones that have the 100% accuracy. And we can see varying accuracy, lower at 2.5 as expected, rising to 100% by the older ages. And I won't read the whole thing, but that's the general pattern that we see for all three places of articulation. Okay, the second way that we looked at accuracy was the proportion of children who produced the phoneme correctly at 75% of the time. So we've got 2% here. And that was called acquired. A child has acquired the phoneme if they produce it correctly, accurately, 75% of the time. And remember, we're talking only about word initial stops. Patterns are going to be different if we're looking at other places of articulation. So again, what do we see? We see that the laryngalized stops here, laryngalized P, T, and K, have a high degree of accuracy, are required by all children from 2.5 on. So it's pretty young. Let's see, can I use this one? Oops, no. I'm trying to see if I can get a jaw pointer. If we look at our aspirated stops, levels of accuracy are quite low, and you'll see that in the 4-year-old group we actually have a reversal. So at 3.5, all of the children had an accuracy level of 75% or more of your aspirated P, but at least one child or some children in the next group up, there was a reversal in terms of accuracy. And that's not unusual in this type of cross-sectional study. You're not looking longitudinally, you're looking cross-sectionally across a group of 10 children. And you may have one child at a particular age that's just not doing what the other children at that age are. And so it will make reversals in terms of these developmental patterns. Okay, so if we think about phonetic complexity, and we look at this mastery, 75% accuracy, which we will call mastery here, we see that the order of acquisition in terms of these 3 types of stops is that the laryngalized stops, or the stops, are first acquired, and they're acquired by the age of 2.5. And that your aspirated stops, which have a long VOT, etc., are acquired between 3 and 3.5. And your Lennis stops are acquired by age 4. This does not seem correspond to the notion of frequency of occurrence in languages of the world. Okay, so what about frequency? So again, order of acquisition is basically fortis stops, aspirated stops, and lentis stops. So what are we going to do when we look at frequency? Well, we looked at two types of frequency. First, we looked at the MacArthur Child Development Inventory, which is a list developed in the United States, but now there's probably 50 or 60 languages for which we have these inventories. Parents are given a list of words, and they're simply supposed to say, does your child produce these words? Doesn't have to be produced correctly. Does your child say these words? Okay. That was one database we looked at. And the second one was a study of spontaneous speech of Korean children who are 3 to 8 years old, and this was from another published study. What both of those databases show is that the lentis category, that is the category that was acquired last by the children learning Korean, occurs most frequently in stop initial targets. That wasn't necessarily expected. And if we look at, so that's what the children are trying to say. So those are the targets. The second category we looked at was input. So if we look at speech directed to children, what are the most common word initial stops? And again, with that analysis, the lentis category was the most frequent in child-directed speech at 12 months. Okay, so to get to some conclusions and observations, and I hope some discussion. Questions remain about, I think we can say for sure there are language-specific differences in phonological acquisition. The problem is, it's difficult to figure out what those are, or whether it's a constellation of certain things coming together so that in a particular language the effects will not follow the basic most common patterns. So I still think people like this notion, want to refer to this notion of articulatory complexity. It seems the most obvious. If it's difficult to make a particular type of production, stop, fricative, whatever it is, it's going to be acquired late. If we think of acquired as meaning when is it produced accurately by children, and then we need to go to how many children, what do you mean when you say acquired, etc., etc. But the basic notion of articulatory complexity is very appealing. But at least in this case, it doesn't seem to answer the questions. And the second one is the input question and frequency question in general. How often does a child hear a particular segment? How often does a child try and produce a particular segment? And what are the effects of those frequency issues on order of acquisition? And again, at least for Korean, it looks like frequency was not a very important, or did not play a very critical role in the acquisition of word initial stops. There may be other aspects of Korean where indeed that did happen. And then finally, the possible influence that has not really been looked at systematically is what are the influences of the size and composition of the target language phonology? So the whole package of phonology. Is it a tonal language? How many segments does it have? What's the nature of its syllable structures? Are there final consonants? Are there not final consonants? What's the maximum word length in terms of number of segments? Etc., etc. There are many features there that presumably have some effect on acquisition, but we really don't know what they are. So I'm leaving you with more questions than answers. But that's where we are right now. So Thanks for your attention, and I'd like questions and comments.